Good evening. I'm Roger Duncan. I'm here to introduce, I have the honor of introducing our speaker for the evening. Hold the mic up some, all right. First, I want to announce the speaker for next week is David Matisoff, and his topic is going to be Cash is King, the Comparative Effectiveness of Solar Incentives. So that will be our speaker at the symposium for next week. It's my pleasure to invite and bring to our campus Virginia Lacy. Virginia is with the Rocky Mountain Institute Electricity Innovation Lab. Rocky Mountain Institute, as many of you know, was formed by Amory Lovins, one of the pioneers of energy efficiency and renewable energy back in the 1981, and have been a leader in this area for many years. The major issue that utilities around the country and around the world, for that matter, have been facing in the last several years is the spread of distributed energy resources, distributed generation in the form particularly of photovoltaics and energy storage and other DER. Utility revenues have gone flat, growth is flat, and it has become clear that the current business model that has been in place, actually it was invented by Thomas Edison's personal secretary, Sam Insel. That's true. Is not going to work anymore. And there is some level of panic, frankly, around the utility industry about what to do. In response to that, several years ago, Rocky Mountain Institute formed the Energy Innovation Lab called eLab, and Virginia was one of the founders of that group, specifically to focus on the new electric utility business model issue. Virginia is one of the true thought leaders in this area in the country. We were very grateful to get her to come to the University of Texas. Dr. Fred Beach and I are teaching a class over at the LBJ School this semester on new electric utility business models. And Virginia agreed to come and talk to us about what she is doing around the country. For example, she is a strategic advisor to the New York Public Service Commission, and I think most people agree that the New York Reforming the Energy Vision process is probably the leading process in the country right now on tackling a new electric utility business model. And she advises corporations and many other public service commissions and such around the country on the struggles involved in this transition that we are seeing, not just from fossil fuels to renewable energy, but from large centralized power plants to distributed energy resources, and the fundamental changes in the way utilities have to do business if they're going to survive. So it's with great pleasure that I turn the mic over to Virginia Lacy. Thank you.
What about right now? Yeah, I can hear that. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And you said this is the, sorry, Harsh, is this the advance? Yeah. Okay, great. So thanks everybody for having me here. I was delighted to have Roger invite me. In fact, I think I got back to him within like 30 minutes when I got the email, especially just because I like coming in and teaching and talking to folks that are really interested in how we can make a difference in the world. In my line of work, sometimes you can get a little jaded. And so it's really helpful to come back and actually get a different kind of energy than the energy I normally deal with. So with that, I am going to give a little bit of some of the talks. I've seen some of you guys from the conversation we had earlier this afternoon. So some of these points and slides will be familiar. Some of them will not. I will dive a little bit into the details of what we're doing in New York as an example of what new utility business models might be able to look like in this emerging future that we're now dealing with. So with that, why don't I just quickly, it's okay. I can do this too. Okay, so I mean, Roger already gave a little bit of a briefing on RMI and what we do. I've been at RMI for almost a decade now, which makes me, I think, one of the old hands. so as Roger was saying, RMI was founded by Amory Lovins about 35 years ago, actually. I was realizing when we were talking about this, my slide is incorrect. And our mission is to drive the transformation of the U.S. and global energy system broadly. So it's a pretty ambitious agenda that we have, and we have a variety of folks working on different things across different energy sectors. So I focus on electricity, but we've also got a practice that's focused on mobility. We've got a practice that's focused on buildings and on industry. So, and we are also, while we have been focused on the U.S. for a lot of the years that we've been in existence, we actually now have really started to focus internationally. So we now have a Beijing office, as well as some work in London. So I will also just give a little bit of background. Like I said, I'm in the electricity practice. We do a variety of different things in electricity, and my experience ranges across a couple of different areas. So what we'll be talking about today, new business models and rate design, is a lot of the focus that we've taken in the last several years. We published a book about 5 years ago called Reinventing Fire, where we were looking at a lot of different scenarios for how we could drive the U.S. economy towards a carbon-free future. And in so doing, what we realized in looking at that on the electricity side is that electricity is actually going to be growing a lot more important. So beyond just the electricity sector, that in order for us to be able to transition off of fossil fuels, we actually need to consider electrifying transportation. And there's a lot of different levers there that really make the electricity system that much more important. And unfortunately, while we have a lot of the technologies and economically we have a lot of the solutions that we could be able to install, a lot of the challenges right now are on the regulatory side, on the business model side, on the pricing side. So we transitioned a little bit in the last couple of years, and so that's where a lot of my work and in the Electricity Innovation Lab, eLab, we've been focused on. Community energy planning, we've also been working with some communities to be able to get to a carbon-free future. We've done a lot of work just in examining the techno-economic solutions in terms of batteries and EVs and solar, et cetera. And then my experience has been a lot in the regulatory reform, particularly in New York, but also in Minnesota and in Hawaii. So what I hope you take away from today is just sort of this overarching story. There is, if you haven't heard paradigm shift when you're talking about electricity sector, then you just haven't been paying attention. There is a rising wave of technology, customer value, regulatory disruptions that are transforming the electricity sector, unlike it ever has gone through before. And we expect that actually to produce some pretty significant changes in much shorter than historical cost recovery periods, which is sort of that business model challenge. The potential for rapid transformation coupled with uncertainty threatens the value and valuation at the heart of traditional utility economics. To ensure the economic, technical, and social viability of our electricity system, it'll be critical to address the underlying business model and regulatory constructs within which electric utilities operate. So that's a lot of words. That's just basically saying we need this to be economically viable in order for us to be able to sustain and actually reach even the carbon reductions that we as a society would like to be able to see. There are a lot of different pathways that are emerging. There are a lot of different challenges that are emerging too, as Roger alluded to. I'm going to talk about the New York Rev vision, reforming the energy vision, as one potential pathway that we are testing to see if this might be a viable pathway forward. So I went over this earlier for some folks, but I think it's really important and critical, so I'm going to do it again. So Electricity 101, no physics necessary. I think it's really important to be really clear when we talk about electricity, the distinction between electricity and other sectors. We hear a lot about telecom. We hear a lot about a lot of different, the deregulation of a lot of different industries, including flight. The challenge that we have is that with electricity, there is a physics issue that we are not going to get around, and that is supply and demand must be balanced instantaneously and continuously at all times. So what does that mean? It means that electricity is not easily stored, and while we talk a lot about storage and it's a sexy topic now, it actually is you're converting electricity to a different form of energy. So you're not really storing electricity, you are, but you're converting it, and you're losing some of it as a result of that. And so the way I refer to it is it's the ultimate perishable commodity or just-in-time manufacturing system. And I was joking about, hearing about oranges and things like that, and this is like electrons. Oranges have nothing on electrons. The delivery system is physically connected across the value chain through a wired network. And that unto itself is what we're talking about when we talk about communal assets and the need for how we think about this as a society. I'll talk a lot about that and why we're thinking about this in this way in the Rev environment. Because of the importance of thinking about this as a system, we actually get a lot of economic value out of that system because we are actually interconnected and able to trade through those wires. Without those wires, unfortunately, we're not able, we could be all little islands and have our solar and our storage, but ultimately what that would mean is a significantly overbuilt system that is duplicative in a lot of ways and is not cost effective for society in terms of the dollars that we invest. So it's important to kind of understand this piece when we start talking about different aspects of electricity. Electricity is a social good. I don't have to say a whole lot more on that except for the fact that, when we talk about telecom and electricity, and I've had friends tell me about telecom, well, the utility is going to go the way of, the iPhone, and we can completely do without the utility, we can completely do without the wires. And the ultimate challenge with that is that while telecom and a lot of other industries potentially can have some differentiation in that way, and electricity powers them, that's the other important thing to note, that we rely so much on electricity for everything that we do. Forget just telecom, but think about everything we do, even pumping our gas. When we have blackouts, we can't even pump our gas. So it's important to think about that, and also from the equity perspectives of when we start to think about ways in which we handle some of these challenges, we have to consider every population. The people that don't care about solar and green power and really are more focused on food on the table, we have to make sure that they're okay too. So that's the other thing just to bear in mind. The last thing I'll just focus on here is some of the historic truths of the electricity system. Centralized generation, we built big plants, and at the time it made it a lot simpler. Bigger is better, economies of scale. I won't go into the physics of it, but there's reasons for this up into the 60s and 70s. It was just bigger, 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 bigger. At some point we hit some physical theories or limits there. And so that's actually starting to shift. AC transmission, our system is built on AC system, was used ubiquitously. Natural monopolies, the entire value chain was integrated as a natural monopoly. Generation, transmission, distribution, it seemed to be that it made sense that one company should have the right and the obligation to serve everyone across that value chain. And that made more sense from an economic perspective, equity perspective, et cetera. And then ever-increasing loads, that's the other thing that Roger mentioned. We've got, well, I'll show some charts on that. So we have always assumed that demand would continue to go up, that load would continue to go up, and we build a business model around that. So we're actually challenged now because we actually don't have that reality anymore. So technology, as we know, has fundamentally transformed the way we live, work, and communicate, and that's definitely true in the electricity system. But we're actually starting to see a dynamic shift. We're starting to see a shift from these large centralized plants, big transmission lines, et cetera, to the ability to be able to serve our customer needs on our own premises, and to be able to use a lot more types of resources and even more clean, much more clean resources to be able to meet our needs. So in terms of where, as I mentioned, where the historical action has been, it's been up the value chain in generation, transmission, distribution. We used to even think at beyond the meter, that was ratepayers. They weren't even people. They weren't customers. They were just ratepayers. They just pay their bill. Where the action is now is that we actually have sort of fundamentally turned it on its head. That is not to say, by the way, I'm not an advocate, and you'll hear that crystal clear. I'm not an advocate that we don't need these assets. But the reality is we have a lot more to be able to gain from tapping this resource that we've been investing in beyond our meters, in our homes, on our roofs, through our thermostats, than we have ever actually tapped. And those assets can bring us a lot of reward and value. So we have a lot of other things going on too, not just on the distributed resources. This is actually the good. There's a lot of really good activity going on in the electricity system. So this is the price of PV and wind and what's been happening in the last 30 years. You all probably are familiar with that if you're interested in all in clean energy. It's becoming much more cost competitive with conventional generation. So this is levelized costs, or the cost per megawatt hour of a variety of different technologies. So from solar to solar thermal, fuel cells, geothermal, et cetera. And this is the conventional. And you'll see that actually, and levelized costs, just to be clear on this, that just means that over the life cycle of the plant, when you install it, all the fuel and everything, when you levelize that out to a per kilowatt hour price, which is like basically what your what the cost is to operate that, everything in, you'll see that these things are actually starting to get really, really close. And it's kind of incredible. And this is unsubsidized. So that also means that wind and solar are becoming competitive in wholesale markets. So when we have been hearing a lot about solar in the last several years, what we've actually been hearing about is a lot about solar on rooftops. It's a lot easier in terms of making that economic case in a lot of cases because of a lot of the policies that we have in place, and also the economic value that you do reap as a distributed resource. What's interesting though is that now utility scale solar and utility scale wind, this is the price of power purchase agreements that we've been starting to see in ERCOT in the Texas region. So that is just to say that solar and wind are even becoming more viable from an economic perspective, even at the wholesale level, much less the retail level, which has been a little bit easier to compete with that price because it's a higher price. Another good story, this is what it's looking like in terms of global installments across the world. This is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which I highly recommend as a great resource, which you guys actually might have access to too through UT. So this is what's been happening most recently in the last couple of years in terms of global installations, fossil fuel and nuclear, and what is being projected. So obviously this is slightly outdated here, but in terms of the projections of what we expect to see for renewables versus fossil fuels and nuclear around the globe. In the United States, the solar story is big on the utility scale solar as well, but the important thing when we're talking about some of the issues that I'll be talking about in the business model side is about the distributed side. So what this map is just showing is the state of distributed solar. These are solar markets around the country right now, so the amount of penetration of solar, period, in a market, and the percentage that is distributed in that market. The reason why this is an interesting statistic or something to think about is because renewables generally, if they're big, you can think about it in terms of the utility business model as if you pull out a big coal plant or big nuclear or something, utility, the business model that they are used to is to be able to put in big stuff. We'll talk about that. And they can sell it to us. They can sell it to us, or they can have a power purchase agreement with somebody else, an independent power producer. But it's not as much of a challenge to the business model. What is a challenge to the business model is when you are producing it for yourself. That is a big issue because of the way in which they are actually recovering the cost of the investment that they make. So, utilities and regulators have been paying attention to this. Sorry, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. If you can flip back to the last slide. It looks like North Carolina is kind of It looks like North Carolina is a big outlier, that it has a lot of solar and it's a very, very small amount of, I guess, distributed generation.
Right.
Can you maybe just tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Sorry, I laugh. I'm from South Carolina, and so I digress. So yeah, in North Carolina, there are some regulatory barriers to third-party solar, or the ability for people to lease solar on their roofs. It's been an issue where, in a lot of states actually, where one of the biggest business models that has been viable and really just grew solar quite a lot is the ability to bring the capital cost down. That actual prohibition creates some challenges, because what you're seeing here in terms of a lot, especially over here in this area, is where leasing just took off, and you're basically just making a lease payment. In this particular context, while I believe North Carolina is one of the biggest in terms of power purchase agreements, actually, like big solar, the ability for customers to put it on their roofs in a cost-effective manner through that business model is less. Is that helpful? Sorry, sometimes I might get into jargon, and if I try and stay above the jargon, but if I lose you guys, just let me know. I'm guilty as anybody of throwing acronyms around that make no sense. Utilities and regulators have been paying attention. So this, I was joking in the class earlier. I created this map, and I was looking to see, what are the different activities that have been going around the country in terms of either utilities putting in reform or advocating or proposing reforms to net energy metering, to adding fixed charges, and we'll talk about that in a minute, a variety of other things. And in 2015, 46 states had activities along those lines. So my map actually turned kind of inside out. So now it looks like I'm highlighting the gray. I'm not. There were 46 different states where regulators or lawmakers or utilities were studying, proposing, or enacting changes around solar valuation because of some of what you guys just saw. Did I see a hand or hear a hand? Okay. Okay, and so while solar grabs the attention, there is a bigger story afoot, which is the broader thing of distributed energy resources, and the way that we define that, just to be clear about this, because it does get a little convoluted. At least for us, distributed energy resources refers to energy efficiency, so those things that basically you can do on your side of the meter as a customer. So energy efficiency, like your Nest thermostat, et cetera, electric vehicles, distributed solar, distributed generation, a variety of, that's basically what I mean, but I want to say that because I include energy efficiency in there, which sometimes gets a little bit tricky. So there are a variety of reasons why the penetration and exponential growth of these different technologies is happening. I won't go through all of this, but we've already talked about, there's technical innovation happening. There's also the need, as we're starting to see more renewables come on the system, what we are, both big and small, we will see a need for the ability to start to think differently about the rooftop solar, which is how can that resource, which is passive right now, it's just collecting energy when it gets it from the sun, cloud comes over, nighttime when the sun sets. All of those issues, how can we start to think about those as a little bit more like virtual power plants where, and Roger was talking about this in the class earlier, we refer to something called effective load carrying capacity in the electricity sector, and all that means is you want to be able to rely on something. As I mentioned, because of that supply and demand has to be balanced instantaneously at all times, means that response has value. So it doesn't really matter if, so being able to ramp down, we build to the peak capacity, the peak need. If you're able to reduce that peak, we don't need to build as much, and it's also cheaper. So you can actually do that through what's called demand response, responsive demand. You can do that through having some of those widgets, really cool stuff like Tesla batteries and all that stuff. You can do that now with smart meters, et cetera. So the technical viability of those things is there, and there's actually a need for starting to think about the synergistic solutions. Data and the Internet of Things, I feel like that's so overplayed to some extent, but it's true, especially in the electricity system where we've been blind behind the substation. The reason why you used to have to call up, actually y'all might not even know this, I'm a little bit older, you used to have to call up the electric utility and tell them that your power was out at times because they didn't know. And the reason they didn't know is they're not like connected, they're balancing on the aggregate. They're not looking at your house and saying, oh, just turned on her toaster again. That's not happening. It's on the aggregate. So that's often why they're totally blind behind the substation. Still is in some cases. New business models, we were talking about that in terms of the leasing, and then innovative financing, reducing the cost of capital, which is also in that realm. So what does that mean? Quickly, it means that you used to just buy, you could buy electricity from the grid, from the utility. You now have the ability, of course, to make it, and that's been around for some time. You can avoid it through energy efficiency, so reduce your demand, or you can shift it, and that's something else that we've been taking a lot of look at, which instead of your traditional demand response where the utility would call you up as a big industrial player and say, man, can you turn it down a little bit, which is truly the way that it worked for quite a while. What we're starting to be able to see is if you take all of that portfolio of solutions that I was just talking about, and the Tesla batteries and all the cool widgets, you can actually start to shift, and we call that demand flexibility. It's being able to respond to a price signal, to be able to lower your bill. So customers are starting to exercise more options, and they're exercising their options for a variety of reasons. It's not just because it's good or it's because it's green. There are other reasons for it. And in Hawaii, where I had the good fortune of living for a while to be able to work with the utility out there in the state, affordability and independence. Hawaii is actually very unique, completely islanded. And it's the most remote population in the world, actually, but it's also islanded in terms of a grid. So it has 4 different grid systems. And unfortunately, that means that they can't actually trade amongst themselves. There's not a lot of balancing that occurs except for on the island. Makes it a little bit more challenging. And the infrastructure that was created in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s is oil. So it's so when we're complaining about gas prices in Hawaii, they're complaining about their electricity prices. It's really significant. We're talking about 4 times what we pay, easy. It's a really big deal for people being able to pay their electricity bills. So in terms of the northeastern United States, that's just a photo of New York City after Sandy and some of the challenges. So for those of you that are familiar with New York, you'll note that, so that's sort of the financial district down there, and Midtown was just, there wasn't a whole lot there going on. So that is a whole issue, and this is what actually will bring me to the Rev discussion, is one of the big drivers here is around resilience. They discovered pretty quickly that they're not as resilient as they would like to be. In terms of the other major driver for corporations is also reliability and clean power. So there are a lot of different corporations that have 100% renewable goals, that want to reduce their carbon emissions. And what we're looking at right here is actually Apple. That's going to be their new headquarters. If it looks like they want to rule the world, I think so too. So that is, they're actually building a microgrid there, and so they'll be able to completely island. And yes, it's going to be expensive, no question about it. But what they did, the calculations on it, they discovered that the engineering cost of installing that actually will be the same as a day of lost time for that whole facility. So, and then this is Walmart, which actually receives 25% of its power from solar now, which always seems to surprise people, but it is one of the big purchasers. Okay, so what does all that mean? So Roger was saying demand has tapered off. Demand has tapered off. There's a variety of reasons for that. A lot of them we just talked about, but in addition to that, so just to kind of come back over here, so you'll notice this dip right here. It's the Great Recession. And so what we're also showing here is GDP, and what happened, of course, that's also the Great Recession. But what we're starting to see is this taking off again of GDP from, this is US, and we're starting to see the flattening, still the flattening of electricity consumption, and that's grid power. So that is what leads me to a conversation that if you guys just bear with me for a second. Some of you have already gone through this with me, so just bear with me. I will not go into the details of utility economics, but this is important just to kind of understand. The way that we currently pay for our power is through cost of service rate making. There's two elements to cost of service rate making. There's revenue requirements, so you're taking everything that it requires that the utility has installed from a capacity standpoint from the steel in the ground. And you're taking the operations of that, so fuel costs and all of the other things that go along with that, customer service, et cetera. And then you have a rate of return that, just to remind ourselves back again on this natural monopoly thing, when we initially, as Roger was saying, Samuel Insull is the guy that was Edison's personal secretary, who then basically led, it's very smart, it was very business savvy of him. There was competition going on in 1910s-ish, where so electricity was just kind of growing up around the US in spurts in different places. And actually, ironically, Edison was more of a distributed system. It's actually like there was more distributed generation in various places. It wasn't like the big power plants that we know now. Samuel Insull saw the writing on the wall when we started to, there was municipalities, cities that wanted to be able to supply people with power. And Samuel Insull also knew that there was going to be some other regulation coming down the pipe, and what he decided was that he was going to go for state regulation, that it was a natural monopoly, that a utility, the electricity utility, is a natural monopoly from generation all the way to the end use, and therefore should not have competition and needed to be regulated. It's pretty smart if you thought that you might kind of go out of business eventually for a variety of different reasons. There is a lot to that. As I said, on the economics side, the economies of scope and scale, economies of scope and scale, there was real heft to that. Where we are starting to now have this challenge is around whether or not that actually holds true today. So we've got this rate of return that the regulator, we want to attract capital to be invested in the electricity system. We want to reward people for investing in the electricity system. In a competitive environment, there is some concern about, that's a really long-lived asset. Am I going to get any money back if we're all competing for that? If this is a 30-year or 40-year asset? So that's sort of the thinking behind it. So the regulator then will stipulate a rate of return for the investor to be able to attract that capital. And it's not a bad system, or it hasn't been a bad system for the last 100 or so years. We then get to how we actually pay for that, and that is where we go to the total revenue translated into rates by segments. So the rates that we all pay, we as individuals are the little houses here, the residential customers. We have commercial customers and industrial. And basically, we just kind of determine that this is everything that's required, the cost of service for the entire utility. We figure out, kind of based on approximation, I will not go into that, as to how you would kind of divide this up. And you come out with what we call kind of conventional rates, which are made up of these three basic charges. Customer charges are the flat monthly charge that covers your fixed cost of billing, that kind of thing. The second thing is a demand charge, and without going into too much of the detail there, I will just say that there's two ways that you can draw, there's two ways that we measure energy in the electricity system. One is your instantaneous demand. So if you go home and you turn on every appliance in your house, you are drawing a significant amount from the power system at that time. There needs to be the generation, the wires, and everything to meet that. So does that make sense to you guys? So it's an instantaneous draw, and that's the energy is, you can think about that as just the flow of that power over time. So you could have a really big draw and then not actually take anything off the system for another month. And depending on how your rate structure is, you actually might be paying a significant amount because of the draw that you took off. Because the reality is somebody had to build the infrastructure to meet your demand. Does that make sense? So anyway, so the combination of these things is how we have typically paid for it. So bear with me, I'm almost done with this, and then it will make sense, I swear. So when we're talking about in the revenue requirement, cost of service rate making, we hear a lot about rate base. That rate base is the stuff in the ground. The rate of return is what you are getting a rate of return on the stuff that you invested. So when you hear about rate base, that's basically what it means. It's the wires, it's all of those pieces. And then we're talking about the rate of return, which is the allowed return on that investment. So as somebody that was in that business, if you're getting a rate of return on the steel that you put in the ground, what is your incentive? Thank you. It's like I planted him. So during a rate case, there's a significant incentive to have more capital investment for more return. So, and the largest investment rather than the most efficient one. There's also little incentive, I shouldn't say no, little incentive, to report lower costs from an operations perspective. Between rate cases, once rates have been set, we have an incentive, or the utility has an incentive for increasing sales, because that's the way that they would be able to get a higher amount of profit. So more energy sales, more revenues, throughput, it's what we call the throughput incentive. There is also, you have an incentive to lower your operating expenses during that time, because that's the margin, right? That's your return. So let's simplify this. So you build stuff. You make earnings. You build bigger stuff. You make more earnings. You build really big stuff. This is the biggest nuclear facility. This is the biggest power plant in the United States. Something like 4,000 acres, something like that. You make really big earnings. So in a time where we were expanding and growing and we needed that from 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with actually getting people a return on the investment that they're providing when it's providing a service that we need. That's actually great. The challenge is that when we have cheaper alternatives, and I'm from RMI, so I'm going to just tell you energy efficiency is always going to be cheaper. But these cheaper alternatives that we have to be able to meet our energy resource needs are not necessarily in the best interest of the utility. Does that make sense? In terms of when a customer builds stuff, shoot, I messed up that animation. The utility gets nothing, right? So you put on, Solar City comes to you and says, I got a great deal. That's Solar City. It's definitely not the utility. So the other complicating factor of this, and we've kind of already talked about this, is and I'm not here, by the way, to bash utilities. You will find out I'm actually a huge advocate. But we have set up a system that is actually not working to get us what we're demanding from them. And so what we end up with is an overbuilt, centralized, inefficient system that's disconnected from customers and what they want. The other thing that I talked through earlier this afternoon with the class that I just want to bear in mind for folks really quickly, and this is all we'll talk about with rate design beyond what I talked about earlier, is that the challenge of the way that we currently pay DER or distributed generation folks with solar is also complicating things and causing ire in the utility industry. So I'm going to walk through this super quick, which is just to say, if you think about it, this is you, your traditional full service customer, if you just take grid power. Throughout a day, this is just a typical day, your peak in this particular system is, I don't know, I don't remember what it was like 5 or something. This is the peak draw on your what the grid is seeing. This is from the perspective of the grid. This is what the grid is seeing over the course of the week. And like you had parties on Thursday and Friday. This is when you actually add solar to your system, to your roof, and you actually wanted to maybe go net zero, and you increased the amount of efficiency that you had, and in net zero energy, it just means over the conventional way of describing it is over the course of a year, you're net zero. But that net is coming from this. This is about, that yellow is still the grid power. That peak is when solar is hitting. That blue is when you're exporting to the grid. So in this particular example, if Joe has put the PV on, he is actually now, this is what he looks like in terms of over the course of the week, potentially. And here in terms of the peak, it's actually when he's exporting power as opposed to importing power, which actually starts to create a whole, we're talking about transactions that have never taken place before. We have always been a unidirectional, build the big thing, we're going to ship it down to you, down to your in use. So that's something that is the way in which we see this. Now, the way it's paid for, we've always had the traditional cost to serve, the customer bill, the cost to serve, and the customer bill should theoretically match. But the question has always been, what's the value of this that's going out onto the grid? If it's, the customer is, what if the customer is not paying enough their full cost to serve? You'll hear things like scary things in the industry about cost shift, and people are paying for other people, and that's basically what this means. And the other question is, what if a customer is not fully compensated for the service that they're providing, which might also be the case. So that is where we get into, finally, as electricity sales have flattened, this is the other thing just to note. Coming back to electricity consumption has flattened. The investment in the system on the distribution side is increased. That's not a bad thing. There are some theories as to why that's going on because of what we just talked about in terms of incentives. But there is also that we're investing more smart meters. We're doing a lot more to digitize our grid, and we need the investment. So when we just go back, if you guys think about it and the way we're paying for this, this is the challenge that we have. One example of it for thinking about how we're going to pay for that. So we have kind of this growing wave of challenges here. And this is, I love this slide. I always try and fit it in if I can, because I think that one of the things that's happened in the last couple of years, I think, is that utility industry for a long time was kind of saying, don't talk to me, this isn't happening. And the reality is that these things can happen very quickly. Industries can change and turn very quickly. And so this is 1900 in New York, where's the first car? This is 13 years later in the same place, and you can't find the horse. So it's just something to consider, And that's why when we work a lot with utilities, like I said, I'm a big advocate, but what we're trying to say is that combating this is not the answer, because you will get swept away. There's a lot of wait and see happening right now in the industry, and then there are some places where they're actually starting to embrace these changes. And that's what I've actually been working a lot on, which is the New York Rev Initiative, which is the Forming the Energy Vision. This is one of my favorite quotes that there was an order that described the need for taking charge here. And so I'm just going to read it. Utilities in this commission could respond to the challenges facing the industry by clinging to the traditional business model for as long as possible, relying on protective tariffs, regulatory delay, and other defenses against innovation. Alternatively, we can identify and build regulatory, utility, and market models that create new value for consumers and support market entrants and this new form of intermodal competition. In other words, embrace the changes that are shaking the traditional system and turn them to New York's economic and environmental advantage. We decisively take the latter approach. So I've had the good fortune for the last 2 years to be able to work in New York and under the leadership of Audrey Ziebelman, who is the chair of the Public Service Commission there. And what they're doing is trying to address these issues by overhauling the regulatory system and the construct with which we reward utilities. So I'm going to talk about that for just a few more minutes, and then help answer questions, et cetera, that you guys have. So really quickly, I want to just be clear, New York is actually pretty advanced generally anyway in terms of a lot of what they've already taken into account, or what they've already done in terms of strategies to try and combat that capital incentive, to put capital in the ground, et cetera. So well, first of all, the Public Service Commission, every state has one, a Public Service Commission, which regulates the investor-owned utilities in that state. So in New York, there are 6 utilities it regulates. The most famous one is Con Ed in New York City. So there are a couple of things that they have already done in terms of trying to incent the utility. First of all, they have 2 to 5 year rate cases now, which is, without going into the details of that, they're trying to extend the amount of time and force innovation between rate cases. I'll leave it at that for now, but I'm happy to talk about that more. They also do full revenue decoupling on total sales. What does that mean? It means what they're trying to do is break apart, or they have tried to break apart the incentive, that throughput incentive. So in other words, the utility, instead of just, gosh, I'm trying to decide so decoupling basically breaks the throughput incentive. You are able to let the utility at the end of the year, you tell the utility that they can still earn the same return, and you adjust rates after the fact. I think I'll leave it at that. I don't know if, yeah, that's it. Roger's like, yeah, you should leave it at that. There's another thing that I'll highlight here and skip over, another performance-based regulation. So the idea for performance-based regulation, and that is a lot of the root of what we're trying to do in New York, is instead of rewarding the utility based on the steel that they put in the ground, we're trying to actually reward them through the rate of return on what they deliver in terms of customer service, in terms of reliability, and in terms of service generally. There's a lot of different ways that you can measure that. There are certain things called SAIDI and SAFE and a variety of other things in the industry, and all that means is, did you keep the power on reliably? Did you, from a customer service perspective, did people like your service? And that's one element. Just to be clear though, this is the stuff that they've already been doing when we started this work. And in terms of performance-based rate making broadly, the questions that are being asked are, did we pay the correct, sorry, we go from did we pay the correct amount for what we got to did we get what we wanted. So I'm going to skip over this, but let me just, this is the important thing. With all of those different strategies that we advocate for and that we think are very viable, this is actually what's still been happening in New York. So the energy demand is still slowing down. Customers are facing higher bills. There is an increasing need for investment, so there's a lot of investment that's necessary from aging infrastructure and replacement, and the utilities returns have been going down. So what we see is that there is a need for something more, and that's what we have been trying to do through Rev. All of these drivers are what we're trying to go to is more a customer-centric, lower-cost, integrated, and clean system. And by doing that, the idea here is to start to think of the utility as a platform service provider. So, and you'll hear platform a bit if you in looking into this. The DSP right there is distributed system platform. So trying to get out of the mental model of the utility as a wires company or the utility as provides generation, to actually think about the utility as an orchestrator of all of the different things that we're investing in to be able to make sure that we still need reliability. We still need a grid. We're going to still need a grid. How do we start to make sure that when we start to put in our electric vehicles, and maybe we have like 5 of them on one feeder, how do we ensure that we're doing that in a way that provides the most value to the system overall and ourselves? We're giving blunt, right now we have blunt price signals. No one has the signals that they need to be able to do that. That's a lot of what we're trying to be able to do in the Rev vision. So in this case, the utility starts to get away from wanting to just invest in things and actually is getting reward for being a platform service provider. So let me quickly, because I know that we're running short on time. There are a few different functions that in the first order in the Rev vision that the Public Service Commission said the utility would provide. Integrated system planning, and that you can think about it as right now, as I mentioned, totally blind behind the substation. Don't know where customers have resources. The idea is to be able to, they will be the central resource for enabling better planning and being able to send price signals and know where we actually can target and defer other investments. Grid operations, they will still be in charge of grid operations. And then more importantly, on this market operation structure and products, there is a very viable market that's on the wholesale level right now. Beyond the substation, for us, there's not. The idea here is to enable customers to start to be able to interact with the system, and the utility will be able to be the orchestrator to enable that. So quickly, I'm going to get into really quickly here. So this is the part that is one of the biggest challenges, and this is what Roger and I have had, and then we'll stop and have conversation here. Platform services. So what exactly do we mean by platform services, and what is the utility going to get paid for? There are, actually I have a couple of examples here. So this is the question, the ongoing question right now that we're wrestling with in the New York environment, which is the utility does provide a service in being the orchestrator of all these assets. We want them to get value for that. The question, though, is how to ensure that we're talking about one entity that has the monopoly, because we are saying we don't want competition in terms of wires. We still believe that there will be one entity that controls the distribution system wires. So the question starts to become, though, if you're the market maker, how do you also be a market participant? And that's the big challenge that we're wrestling with, but some of the things that we've started to think about are dividing out the competitive functions and the monopoly functions that the utility serves and can serve. So competitive functions. There are definitely needs across advertising they could act as an advertiser or conduit for third-party providers. So they could actually make sure, like if you want to upgrade your home in some way and you have no idea where to go to, the utility has actually got you as a customer already. You're already going to the website at times to be able to pay your bill, et cetera. They can actually serve as a purveyor and be added value. Energy services financing, this is a huge one, which is about on-bill financing. Right now, we ask people, in fact, I'm dealing with this myself, we ask people to invest in new windows, all sorts of new things. That's a huge capital cost up front. The utility actually could provide financing and being paid back, they could be paid back on your bill. So that's another thing. Engineering service for microgrids, Roger has already said on the microgrids front that yes, we also agree there's probably a huge value play there. There's a lot of other things. Then there's, on some of these aspects, we believe that they're monopoly functions, and then therefore the question is how should we continue to pay for those services? Is it continue just to be in the domain of the utility? And how would that actually, the provision of those services, come to light? So I'm realizing that we're getting short on time. So why don't I just go into the very last example of something that is happening as an example of the Rev work that we've been doing. Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Program. Somebody mentioned this in the class this afternoon. Con Ed actually had a substation in Brooklyn, Queens that needed to be upgraded to the tune of $1 billion. $1 billion is a lot of money. And so the Con Ed actually, to give them significant credit, worked with the Public Utilities Commission and said, we hear you're about to do this REV thing. We think that there could be maybe something we should consider here. So $1 billion to invest to upgrade that substation means that that cost is going to be socialized. That cost is going to be paid by everyone. So there's a real opportunity there in terms of reducing that cost so that $1 billion, if you could meet that same need with other assets that the customer is installing, you save $1 billion on one end, and then it's the net of whatever else that the customers have invested in. So in doing a lot of the analysis, so that 69 megawatts that they need to be able to meet for 40 to 48 hours by 2018. Just for reference, there's 8,760 hours in a year. This is how we operate our system right now. We operate it based on like 4 hours of the year we need to meet peak. This is 40 hours in the year that would require $1 billion. This is why there's a lot of value that can be reaped from operating the system in a more constructive way. So what they're doing is they're taking, Con Ed has deployed significant resources to try and get 41 megawatts of customer side, and they're going to be installing 11 megawatts of utility side solutions for load relief. There will also be 17 megawatts of conventional investment, which is a little bit more on the grid side. And the total budget over 3 years is $200 million for a significant savings. The way that the utility, coming back to that last point where we were seeing the guy with his pockets out and that they don't get anything when customers invest. So there's 3 earnings opportunities for Con Ed. They are getting the regulated rate of return on the investments. They're also getting 100 basis points return on equity adder tied to the performance targets of meeting this need. And then they're also getting 50% of the calculated savings. So it's not an entire $800 million savings they are going to get. It's more of like a $400 million savings to the system, because we want to incent the utility to want to do this. So I'm going to stop there because I see I'm exactly at 6:15, which I realize does not leave a lot of time for questions. So I apologize for that, but I get pretty excited about talking about some of these things. Are there questions that I can answer for you guys?
So I guess I'm question one here. With so much disruption occurring in the utility business, what they really have been doing is operating at a level where they know their customer and they know the product that they're providing. And with this disruption, you're talking about them having to search for a new business model that'll be repeatable and scalable.
Yeah.
And how do you foresee that happening? Do you foresee that happening by the way of acquisitions and partnering, or do you see that happening in innovation within the utilities themselves, or a combination of that?
I think it's going to be different in different jurisdictions and different places. So like in Hawaii, where I was talking about earlier, I think that there may have to be a reconsideration of how the grid is operated and in that environment, and thinking about the utility model in a very, very different way. There's been talk about what's called an independent distribution system operator, which would enable, it would completely break, I mean, it's a nonprofit that's like ERCOT here in this environment. And I think that would kind of break apart in that particular construct the utility business model entirely. I think in some places, though, you're going to probably see, and this is already starting to happen, partnership amongst what's usually called third-party providers, which is basically your solar cities, it's your Teslas, et cetera. I think we're actually going to start to see some really interesting things happening with what we would conventionally consider utilities. And in fact, to be honest, they're already investing, ironically. There are utilities that are actually investing in some of those third-party providers. We've been trying to encourage some of those partnerships as well, because we see a lot of economies of scale from those partnerships. And then I think in this particular construct, I think we are going to start to see a move away from traditional cost of service rate making, and we're going to be going into more of an environment where we start to look at performance-based rate making and other opportunities to ensure that it's viable.
Hi, thanks for your talk. You mentioned that renewables is part of what's happening in terms of transformation of the industry, but not all of what's happening. I guess my question is, hear a lot of debate about carbon price or carbon policy. And I guess my question is, do you view that as an important part of aligning some of these market forces, or do you see it as like helpful but not necessary, or how does that really interact with how you've everything you've talked about today?
I think it's an important driver, and I think with the Paris Agreement and some other things, I do think, I mean, with the Clean Power Plan that we've seen from EPA, that is a driving factor. I'm actually working with Duke Energy in North Carolina right now, which they're retiring some coal. There's a lot of reasons for that, and if you follow the markets, you also know that natural gas is a huge driver and the reason why it's not just about environmental regulation. But I also think that a lot of folks see the writing on the wall, and to try and invest more in assets that have been sitting around for 40 years anyway is probably not in their best interest. So I think it's going to be a huge thing. And in fact, I think, let's see if I can get my stat right, something like 50 gigawatts of coal was being retired this past year. That, again, natural gas is a huge player in that, but also the threat of carbon pricing in a lot of different places. I mean, we do have it in California and the Northeast already. Probably not in my neck of the woods in the Carolinas anytime soon, but So yes, it is a huge thing, and it will just accelerate this. I mean, it's kind of similar to when you run the economics on any of those clean technologies. It's going to pan out better. Yeah.
Howdy. Sorry. So it seems like California's taking a much more incremental approach to these things. They're pushing hard for empowered customers and distributed.
Oh, they get mad when you say that.
But, I mean, compared to New York, they certainly are. But do you think that the two sorts of approaches, the sort of top-down and bottom-up, are going to converge in the middle somewhere? Do you think that they're going to have fundamentally different outcomes?
Oh, this is a great question. So, so in California, for those of you that have been following it, California is also looking at this more from, I would say, the planning approach on the distribution system. So, and also, it's not up there anymore. Hold on one second. Let me come back over here. Some examples, they're hoping to be able to achieve something like this by being able to be more proactive with their distribution system planning and then really being able to reap the value. They are not talking about the business model as much right now. And I will say, for a while, I was like, New York obviously has their act together so much more. I do actually see the value, though, in being incremental at times. I will say that it has been really interesting for me to observe with 400 to 500 staff members in the Public Utilities Commission, which is a significant size of a Public Utilities Commission. Hawaii has like 20 people. And they're dealing with significant changes themselves. There's 400, 500 people in the Public Service Commission in New York, and all the stakeholders that are involved, the sheer amount that they have bitten off, it's humbling. And and I think too, some people have actually felt like, whoa, like what happens if we create changes too fast that we actually end up. Could we create some challenge, God forbid, an Enron situation like California? So I see both, but yeah, I think that we're going to see a convergence, best practices, quite honestly, from both of those states, even though nobody wants to say that they would follow California. Yeah.
So in New York and in California, the Public Services Commission generally regulate investor-owned utilities like Con Ed. And in Texas, we have a couple of publicly or municipally owned utilities. So I'm curious how, whether you think a program like Rev in New York could work for a place like Austin, for instance, where the energy company is controlled by
Also
the...
a great question. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I should have even caveated a little bit of what I was saying. So a lot of the utility business model that I've been talking about is the investor-owned utility business model. When we're talking about that rate of return, we're talking about, there are other models. There are co-ops, and I think there's like I'm trying to remember how many, there's thousands of rural co-ops and co-ops broadly, which means member-owned, and then municipal. So Austin, Sacramento is a really big one. And to be honest, they've been the leaders in a lot of ways. We have Roger here to thank for that on Austin Energy. But also with, it does show a little bit of an interesting, trying to parse my words here. I think that the munis and co-ops have more leverage in a lot of instances to be able to control their own destiny than in the investor-owned utility model. So while I absolutely think that it could happen that, a Rev-like approach, to be honest, there are some that are already kind of going down that path without having a regulator be on top of them to make it happen. In particular, Green Mountain Power up in Vermont is fascinating what they're doing right now. And they're seeing that kind of writing on the wall and being proactive about it. So yes, and I think that there's actually a lot more opportunity in some instances.
I guess that will be all. Oh, you have a follow-up question?
Actually, yeah, I had a question first. Or as long as it's already here, I guess. Kind of a follow-up to the previous question with regards to California.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the initiatives that CAISO, the California regulator, has been trying to get through the legislature there is market merger with some of the neighboring states. And
Yeah.
I'm also curious to hear what you think about the potential for something like that initiative to work, and how about the utilities there?
I think it would be great, particularly because what that brings is economies of scale in the same way, in a similar way that we were talking about earlier. So there have been a lot of studies that have been done to show that the amount of reserves and additional plant capacity that you need is reduced because of the sharing that can take place in that market structure. So, and orders of magnitude of cost savings that have come from that. There's, as you can imagine, if you think about that, so that's really cool for the customer. There are some reasons why that's hard to make happen, because who has the incentive or disincentive to make that happen? It would be those guys that own the power plants. So that's been actually some of the challenges at times. But yeah, it's a really cool opportunity, and I think it offers, it helps to integrate renewables. That's a big part of enlarging the balancing area and the market, is that you can start to balance that variability with solar and wind a lot easier when you have a bigger, what we call a stack to draw from, when you have a lot more capacity to be able to draw from.
We'll take one last question. We'll wrap it up after that.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Yeah.
So I'm from the southeastern region of Texas, where we actually lie outside of the ERCOT market. We're under a monopoly investor-owned utility, and I'm entirely convinced that at this point, we are effectively just ratepayers still. So I'm wondering how do you convince an investor-owned utility that operates under a monopoly that they are going to, in fact, get swept away by this wave?
You just asked the meaning of life. What we've been trying to do over the last, I mean, this kind of goes back to RMI's roots, is to make the economic case. It's actually why I do what I do. I come from a conservative background. My family is, I mean, I'm not getting into the politics of this, but I just want to be clear, very free market. I come from a red state, and my family is a part of them. And I have been a Republican for a long time. Maybe not so much this election. So that said, the reason why I do what I do is because I don't think that we should be doing this just because, or we're not going to convince people based on the environmental attribute. So if there are ways in which that you can make the case for the dollars in a lot of different ways, either from customer interest, value, whatever it might be, if there is, and this is what's actually happening with Duke Energy right now, that Duke Energy has been listening to the customers. They tried to actually put in a really big gas plant, and the community said, yeah, that's really not what we want. And what's really interesting is they finally, from a PR perspective, pulled back and said, you know, we've had a lot of issues on a lot of levels in the Carolinas with coal ash spills and a lot of things. I think it was kind of being opportunistic about a crisis in some ways. Like, some of those things just converge at the right time. You get the right people in the room, and that's why we're actually able to be doing what we're doing right now and working with the community to actually, they're going to be building local resources, Duke will, in addition to leaning on the community for energy efficiency, demand response, et cetera. And we're trying to work with the Public Utilities Commission to create the shared savings that would enable them to see that as a possibility. I think, honestly, if there's the community demands it, then they start to actually pay attention. But without that, it can be really difficult, especially if it's not in their economic interest. So I know that that's oversimplistic, but that's sort of, that's where I come from. Yeah.
Virginia, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We really appreciate it. Thank all of you for attending, and we will see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks.